Kids, I'm about to start a new project here, and it's happening today. And this is the deal. It's going to be called My Paranormal Life, volumes 1 through whatever it takes to get through the 40 years I've been involved in the paranormal. Just to warn everybody, though, that I may be tuning in just to hear paranormal stuff and decide they want to go fishing back in the history of my videos. I have many more interests, lots of opinions on just about everything. Plus, I used to do stand-up comedy years and years and years ago. So I have a very dry, very sarcastic, very sneaks up on you kind of sense of humor that you really have to pay attention to, or you might miss it. Use it. Um, I'm kind of an acquired taste. So I'm not claiming to be anything I'm not. And if you're thinking that I'm just this one trick paranormal pony, or that because I'm not, and I have other opinions that you may or may not disagree with in your regular life, um, if you need to discount my paranormal, that's fine too. But I wanted you to warn you that it's there. So if you go looking for trouble, you'll find it here. I'm good at stirring up trouble. Now that that's all said, let's get into the paranormal. Now, 40 years ago this year, I was visited by my great grandmother on my father's side. Now, this is unique and interesting because I'm adopted, so I'm not a blood relative of any of those people, let alone my great grandmother. I only remember meeting her a few times, and I remember hearing about her a lot. And I remember being threatened with death every time we went to go see her. Um, she was a very, supposedly very stern, strict, no nonsense broad that had little tolerance for things not going her way. She was a tough cookie. She lived in an old Victorian house that had a parlor, and children were to be seen and not heard. And I can remember going over to her house on several occasions. The things that stick out most in my mind were the fact that we were to sit on the floor and not the furniture when we were in the parlor with her. We were to be seen and not heard, and she always took a moment with each of us as young children to ask us how how we're doing, or some trite question, and then she would hand out um, these age inappropriate gifts, toys for us to play with. For example, at the age of 6, getting a Porsche keyring, like a little swag. Uh, at the age of 6 back in the 70s. So you can imagine that was all the rage. And then you were supposed to sit in silence and play with your little age inappropriate gift that didn't do anything. Um, so I do remember that about her. That was kind of interesting. And then the other thing I remember is that she had mynah birds. And most people don't even talk about mynah birds anymore. They're these blackbirds that talk like parrots, kind of. And she had several of them in cages in her in the dining room off the kitchen. That was not her formal dining room; it was her informal dining room. It also had like a big table type setup in there. I remember. I'm seeming to remember it was like heavy wood. Anyway, that was my great grandmother. Now, my grandmother on my father's side, um, Margaret. I love Margaret, by the way. She was also a really tough broad that took great delight at times in making just about anybody in the universe cry. She could be that mean and wicked, but never with me. With everyone else in the family, strangers, you name it, she could just go off on an instant and just read you to filth, and she just had a way about her. But she never did it with me. And um, I don't know why, but I guess I was her favorite. So, but she taught me some of those skills of how to just be absolutely ruthless um, to people. So I miss her so much because my grandmothers were actually the ones I was closest to. But I digress. Margaret was terrified of my great grandmother. And that was the only time I ever saw Margaret terrified of anyone or anything in her whole life. It was my great grandmother. And she used to talk about openly, at least to me, how terrified she was of this woman, both when she was alive and then more so after she was dead because she felt safer talking about it. But my great grandmother did something wonderful, and even Margaret said it was the most amazing thing. I never expected it because I always thought she hated me. Um, she hand painted, gold leafed china for Margaret and my grandfather for their wedding. And she did it all by hand with this super fine china that she had imported from Europe. And then she herself applied the gold leaf. And I still have that set of china in my house right at this moment. So I have both of them with me all the time. Now, my paranormal story begins like this. One night I am in Newport Beach, California. I am sleeping in my bed. It's kind of foggy outside, which is not uncommon on the Pacific coast. Um, I remember feeling someone pulling my foot. And I woke up and there was this woman standing there, um, looking at me. And she had this kind of white nighty thing on. And she had long, very long gray hair. She wasn't particularly heavy, but she wasn't, super skinny either. Um, but she was on the gaunt side, I guess is the best way to describe it. And she was standing with her palms out, pointing to the side, standing at my closet, which I faced my closet in that room, and she was just standing there, looking. And she had regular eyes, just like people, and you couldn't see through her, just like people. And so I woke up kind of surprised because I didn't really at first recognize her because, like I said, I rarely got to go see her. And she stood there for a second, and I remember just saying, "This is odd," but I didn't have any kind of fear. I just had more of like, why am I getting woken up for? What purpose am I being woken up for? Was kind of the extent of the thought process. And she started walking towards me. So I thought, okay, well, we're going to hear about why I'm being woken up in a second. And instead of like walking around the side of the bed to talk to me, she just walked right through the bed and right through me. Now, it was a very strange sensation. It had this like tingly, hot but cold, but freezing cold, kind of like cold burn sensation when she walked through. And she got about right up to my pelvis area. And because she was taller than I am at the time, not by much, but taller, because I was a real tall kid. She stopped and she bent down forward, and she spoke in my ear, and I could feel her hair falling on my body as she bent over. And she said, "I'm giving you intuition." Now, to a 9-year-old at that time, I had no idea what intuition was. Didn't sound scary, didn't sound bad, didn't sound good either. It just sounded strange. So then she stood up straight and she continued to walk all the way through me and at my head, through the headboard, into the wall, which goes into a bathroom, and then vanished. There was like no trace of her. So I kind of sat there and I was thinking, like, what is this? And what's intuition? And why am I getting it? And did I do something good or did I do something bad? And my adopted child syndrome kind of kicked in. And I sat and pondered this for the longest time. And I was pondering it as I fell back asleep because I was exhausted. And probably 3 hours had passed, and the phone rang really early in the morning. I mean, extremely early. And the minute it rang, I popped up, and I knew that it was my grandmother calling to tell my father someone had died. I knew it. I just knew it. Um, and when my father answered the phone, I predicted how many seconds it would take before my grandmother spit it out, and I almost predicted his response, which was, "Oh shit." So, you know, that was exactly his words, "Oh shit." And then he started to have a conversation trying to, calm the situation with my grandmother and say, we'll take care of this and this and blah, 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 blah. So they had this conversation. And I knew, for some reason, I needed to go to this funeral, even though I hadn't been told somebody had died yet. So later that morning, they were discussing, my mother and my father were discussing it. And since we were still kind of young, I was 9, my brother was like 7. Um, they were discussing this funeral, and I said, I want to go to this funeral. And my father was like, what the hell do you know about funerals? And my mother basically said the same thing. You're a kid, you don't need to be going to any funerals. I said, well, it's my great grandmother. For some reason, I feel really like I need to go to this. And I'm almost 10, and I really need to, go. I'm getting old enough. So my parents kind of looked at me, and my mother said, I think you're just trying to get out of school. And my father said, well, hold on, we'll think about it. So I kept pressing the situation, and I kept making arguments, more and more intelligent arguments about why I needed to go. So they finally relinquished, and they let me go to the funeral. And it was up in San Bernardino, California. And I remember going to a church, and we didn't attend church in my house. My parents were both religious prior to getting married because they were from different religions, different Christian cults, so to speak. So they couldn't agree on what to teach us. My mother got her way on what we will be baptized. We were baptized Lutheran. But my father was not into going to the Lutheran church, and my mother was not about to let us go to Episcopalian church and blah, 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 blah. So that became a fight that they never settled, and they just decided that they weren't ever going to discuss it, and that we would make up our minds when we grew up, which is the most wonderful thing they ever did for me, actually. So we went to this church, and I just remember it was an old church, wooden. It had like the whole steeple thing and the big A-frame, and it was pure white, and it had these, what they call praying hands, which I never knew what they were, but they were very intriguing looking to me. So, and they were everywhere. There was a disc of them outside, they were inside, they were everywhere. It was like the theme of that church was these praying hands. So I remember walking up, it was hot. We were dressed in suit, and we walked up the steps to the front door of this big wooden front door, and I remember my father pulling it open, and I remember, damn, that was heavy. And inside, I just remember like all these pews and people and colors and praying hands. And I looked forward down the aisle, up to where I guess the altar is or whatever, wherever they make the show. And there was a casket, an open casket. Now, as a kid in the 70s, especially in the early 70s, you did not see open caskets on TV. Things like that just were not discussed. Everything was always a closed casket on TV. It was very sterilized, blah, 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 blah. So I didn't know anything about any open casket kind of thing. And since it was my first funeral, I looked at it and just kind of my eyes went, And there was this woman laying in the casket, and it was the long gray-haired lady that I'd seen a couple days before that came to my room, and she was wearing the exact outfit that she was wearing in the casket. And I was like suddenly just overcome, and I dropped on the floor, just dropped. Legs went out from underneath me, everything. And my parents were positively mortified. Um, and my mother grabbed me with her fingernails like she always did. And she says, "Get up." She always talked through her teeth. She would smile and go, "Get up, you're humiliating us." And pinch me really hard so I bled. That was her style. She was cute. I loved my mother. Anyway, um, so I pulled myself up and I was just captivated. There was this woman that was in my room that told me I had this thing that I didn't know what it was. So I walked down the aisle. I sat down with my parents. My stomach began to growl ridiculously loud, like it never had in its whole life. It just go, and everyone in the church could hear it. And my mother kept smacking me in the stomach, telling me to knock it off, as if I had any control over that. So I'm like, what am I going to do? What am I supposed to do? Um, but we got through it, and then we had to go to the after party, I guess. I don't know what you call that. I still don't know what you call that. But they had this party at her house after, or a gathering or whatever. This party, it was people, food, drinks, the whole 9 yards. So that's a party at her house after the service. Now, I do recall that the entire time that I knew of her and that my grandmother knew of her, she had always had this same black, black maid that always wore this very formal uniform. And she was very close to this black maid. This black maid had been with her for more than 35 years, maybe, or longer. So they were very attached. And this maid was very loyal to her. So obviously she treated her well, I guess. But she was also very strict. I mean, it was very, we knew who the boss was and who the servant was. It was very clear. They weren't friendly. They were a very good professional relationship, supposedly. Now, because it was her house and she had rules for parties and stuff like that, she, of course, left that with the maid. And the maid was there to enforce those rules. So, for example, children were not to be in the living area at all, ever. And if there was a party going on, children were to be put in the informal dining room where the minor birds were at the table to eat and drink in safety and peace without making a mess. And that's where you stayed. There was just no going out and conversing around with the crowd. I got placed there, and I was the only child at the funeral, so I got sat at the table by myself, and with these minor birds. And so I was looking at the minor birds. I was eating my food that they gave me, and drinking, and whatever it is, punch or whatever. And so I was, basically just checking out the minor birds. And suddenly, the minor birds started squawking and talking, and their whole tempo changed, and their attention spun around, and they all turned in their cages to look towards the kitchen door, which was this swinging door. And they were staring at it like someone was coming. And so I looked too, and I didn't see anybody coming, but I knew there was. And as soon as the door opened, which it did, physically opened, it was the maid who had come in through another direction, I guess another entrance into the kitchen. And she came out and she looked at me and she looked at the minor birds, she looked at me, and she says, "Why y'all looking at the door?" And I said, well, they started looking at the door, so I started looking at the door. I guess they heard you coming. She's like, oh no. She goes, they never respond to me like that. They have a whole different response to me. That's your great grandma. She goes, there's something about you that I can tell. And she was standing with the door open. And behind her appeared my great grandma. She appeared in that same white thing with the gray hair flowing down and the whole 9 yards. And the Mina birds started to react to her as this lady started to question me and the Mina birds, and the Mina birds started squawking. And I looked, and my eyes kind of grew big because here's this lady that just suddenly appears. And there was like a sink and another counter next to a stove, and she kind of appeared in like that little corner. Um, and I looked, and I'm like, and the lady turned around. She says, "You can see your great grandmother, can't you?" I'm like, "Yeah." She goes, "Yeah, because the Mina birds never do what they're doing unless she was around. That's the only time they react like this, and they're all paying attention, and they're all looking exactly where you're looking." So she then slowly, she goes, "Can you see her?" And I said, "Yeah." She goes, "Where is she?" And I pointed to where she was. She said, "Okay." So she must be a lot closer to you than you ever imagined. And I said, "Guess so. I don't know." And so she closed the door very slowly. My birds kind of calmed down a little bit. And then she walked over to me. And she said to me, she said, "Listen." She goes, "I knew your great grandmother for a very, very long time." And she goes, "For some reason, she's picked you. You seem to be the special one." And I'm like, "What does that mean?" And she said, "Well," she goes, I heard stories about this from my parents. And I heard some stories from different sources. And she was very shady about saying too much. She was trained not to. So she said, "I'll just tell you this." She goes, "She gave you something, didn't she? You saw her before. You've seen her before since she died." And I said, "Yeah." She goes, "But you haven't told anybody, have you?" I'm like, "No." She goes, "Don't." She goes, "Some things are just better left unsaid." I'm like, "Okay." And she said, she goes, "Just remember that it's not a curse, but it's also not a gift." She goes, "She's just passing something down to you. And be careful with it, because don't let it control you. You got to control it." Just didn't make much sense to me as a kid. But it stuck with me. And she said, "All I can tell you is just, and one day you'll know when it's okay to say something." Okay. So as she said that, the Mina bird started acting up again. And she was closer to me now, so there was a space between her and this swinging door. And my great grandmother appeared again in front of the swinging door in the same room. And I looked, and the maid rose up, and she just got this chicken skin. And she said, "She's right behind me, isn't she?" And I said, "Mm-hmm. She's right there, wearing the same outfit she wore in the casket. Same outfit she wore when she came and visited me the night she died." And she said, "She came to you the night she died in that outfit?" I'm like, "Yep." Said, "Scared the hell out of me when I went to the church." So she, maid said, "Okay, well, I'm going to go in the other room now. And remember, she was very strict, and this is still her house. So you stay here, because you're not allowed out there in that other room. You know it, right?" And I'm like, "Mm-hmm, I remember." And so she goes, "Try to behave yourself." And she gave me a little kiss on the forehead, and she went off to, go serve the folks, the people that were at this party. And me and the Mina birds just hung out. And my great-grandmother kind of vanished away. And that was that. That was the beginning of my paranormal life. That was um, the first two events, and they were relatively close together. And it had a profound effect on me for the rest of my life. And one thing I can say, and I've spoken about this topic in totally unrelated to paranormal videos, but being adopted, you had adopted child, I had adopted child syndrome really bad. And I always wondered what I did, or what was it about me that made her pick me over one of her own blood relatives, because my dad's sister had her own kids, and those were blood relatives. And I was just a piece of merchandise that got purchased twice before birth. So I always thought, wow, what made me so special? And I've always wanted to know that. And that's one thing, and we'll fast forward to another volume or two later. I have spoken with my great-grandmother and seen her several times in 40 years. She has come at times where I really needed her. And that's the one question she will not answer at all. But my grandmother tried to. She said to me, when she was dying, she goes, of all the grandkids I've had, great grandkids, she goes, you're the only one that ever shows up and gives a shit. And just shows up on your own dime. She goes, you've always been my favorite. She goes, you also have this really delightful personality and this sense of humor that I always liked and enjoyed. So she goes, maybe your great grandmother liked it too, and she could see something in you as a kid that she didn't see in anybody else. So I said, that's nice. So I guess that's, I have to live with that as the answer for now. But that was my first story, and for me, it changed the rest of my life. That from that moment on, I started being able to know things before I was supposed to, or I would get warning flashes that, even though I was very tempted to do something I maybe shouldn't. And anytime I let my ego override it, and I ended up paying dearly for not listening to my intuition, which I did a lot. I remember just feeling like this really hard physical slap in the face when reality came back and said, I told you so. And I always felt like it was her slapping me for being an egotistical little shit. And even as a young adult, same thing. So that's my first experience with paranormal. And in this series, I'm going to try to go in a chronological order of how I perceived things, and things changed, and new things happened, and ideas changed, and experiences, and all that kind of stuff. So I hope you enjoy it. It's very personal, but it's also very good for aggregate paranormal investigators to know that there are people or things out there that happen that can't necessarily be explained, like how I can know things before I'm supposed to know, or see things that happened in the past or are going to happen in the future, or and on different levels. It's quite amazing, and I was amazed, and I still am today. So anytime someone looks too confident at you that has abilities, or wants to wring you out of a lot of money, or give something away for free, or make you attached to them, usually you're getting scammed. And there's a lot of scammers out there, and it's really sad. But most people that are legitimate, they only charge because there's kind of a thought out there that if you don't, then it's useless, and then people, basically throw it away. And the other thing that they'll say is that if it's worthless, it's useless. Well, sometimes they'll charge, but if they charge too much, they're ringing you out. And if they don't charge anything and they don't give you a reason why, but then they want you to keep coming back or whatever, watch out for that too. There's always a tail. Usually, like I'm retired, so I'll do card readings and stuff for people for free because I don't work anymore. But I used to charge for that. And I used to charge, I got a pretty handsome fee for my time, um, especially the more I did it. So just be careful with the paranormal. Be careful with people that have claims. Be careful with people like me because if they have a bad intention, it's going to show up. And just listen to your gut, and it'll tell you. Because I've gotten scammed myself. So that's it for now. Talk to you later.